Germany, March 1945. The war was collapsing, but in the skies above the Rhine, the Luftwaffe still had one weapon that terrified Allied pilots: the Me-262 jet. It was fast, sleek, and nearly untouchable. Its twin Jumo engines gave it a top speed over 500 miles per hour, 50 miles faster than any piston fighter in the world. The Allied airmen called it the Silver Death. It could appear, strike, and vanish before the escort fighters could even react. But not this morning. High above the clouds, two silver P-38 Lightnings are escorting a bomber group toward Kassel. The air is thin, brittle, and burning cold. The Lightning's turbochargers scream, propellers a shimmering blur. Then, radar warning. Two Me-262s, diving from 28,000 feet. The German pilots open throttle, certain they'll close the gap in seconds. It's what they always do. Only this time the gap doesn't close. Instead, the P-38s climb. Their contrails vanish into the sunlight, their speed climbing past what the Allison engines were ever supposed to deliver. The jets fire miss, and then, impossibly, the American fighters gain. The Lightnings turn into the sun and streak forward, climbing past 470 miles per hour. The Me-262s can't match the angle. One jet overshoots and flashes past, its pilot shouting over the radio, "Das ist nicht möglich." Down on the ground, the airbase at Wattisham erupts in static and confusion. Controllers are watching speed readings they don't understand. Lightning flight reports sustained climb at 70 inches manifold pressure, one officer says, eyes wide. That can't be right. The engine would explode. But the engines don't explode. They roar. Below, at the muddy edge of that same airfield, a mechanic named Frank "Torch" Kellerman wipes his hands on a rag blackened with benzene and oil. His hair is slick with sweat and fumes. Behind him sits a makeshift mixing rig. Metal drums, glass bottles, and a rusted fuel pump salvaged from a crash truck. He's been up all night, blending a fuel ratio that no regulation would ever approve. He hears the roar overhead, the twin Lightnings streaking home, and allows himself a rare smile. He knows that sound, the clean, hard tone of engines running too hot to be legal, too perfect to be official. The mechanics called him Torch because everything he touched seemed to catch fire. In test benches, in engines, and sometimes nearly in his hands. But this time the fire was under control. It was tamed. He didn't build a new weapon. He simply changed the math. Kellerman had been told that 150-octane fuel was the upper limit, that more would risk detonation, melted pistons, engine seizures. "Don't mess with chemistry you don't understand," the engineers said. But he understood it better than they did. Not from books, but from years of racing, tinkering, and blowing up engines in barns. He knew that chemistry wasn't the limit. Fear was. What he had mixed under that tarp the night before wasn't supposed to work. It was a volatile blend of aromatic compounds, benzene, toluene, and alcohol, combined with a dash of ethyl fluid that would have made a chemist faint. The result? A blend that resisted detonation longer, burned hotter, and gave the P-38's Allison engines more oxygen per piston stroke than any regulation fuel could. He called it rocket soup. When he tested it on the ground, the first engine ran too lean, nearly melted a cylinder head. The second test worked. Pure, steady power. No pinging, no knock. Just a clean, rising hum. He knew he'd found something dangerous and beautiful. The brass didn't approve. They didn't even know. But for the first time in months, the Lightning pilots had something the Luftwaffe couldn't match: speed on demand. As the planes landed, Kellerman walked toward the flight line. The pilots climbed out, still breathing hard, eyes wide with disbelief. One shouted, "Torch! What the hell did you feed her?" He shrugged. Just a little courage in liquid form. In a war where perfection came from factories, Kellerman had done the unthinkable. He'd changed the outcome with a wrench, a barrel of fuel, and a refusal to obey. Because sometimes victory doesn't come from new machines. It comes from one man crazy enough to burn cleaner than the rules allow. In every war, there are invisible limits, not written in the enemy's playbook, but in your own. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, that limit was octane. The belief was simple. Engines have a ceiling. Push the fuel too far, and it doesn't give you power. It kills you. Detonation, knocking, pre-ignition. The silent killers of flight. Commanders trusted chemistry only when it came stamped with a government seal. The manual said 100, 130 fuel for safety, 150, 150 for emergencies. Anything beyond that? Madness. But Frank Torch Kellerman had never been afraid of madness. Officially, every P-38 Lightning ran on high-octane avgas, refined in massive plants stretching from Louisiana to Liverpool. It was a triumph of Allied logistics, gallons of liquid fire feeding thousands of aircraft every day. The 150-grade fuel, rich in tetraethyl lead, was the product of years of research by Shell, Standard Oil, and the Bureau of Aeronautics. It could resist detonation pressures that would turn standard gasoline into a bomb. It was, as the Air Force put it, the pinnacle of wartime chemistry. And yet that pinnacle still had cracks. Pilots complained that their Allison V-1710 engines ran rough at high altitudes. Mechanics noted burned valves, uneven compression, and power loss during climbs. The turbochargers could push more air than the mixture could handle. Engineers warned against exceeding 60 inches of manifold pressure, the point where the fuel simply couldn't keep up with the oxygen demand. Beyond that, "You're burning the metal," one report read. Kellerman didn't buy it. He knew the language of combustion like other men knew prayer. He had spent his pre-war life tuning race engines for county fair dirt tracks, chasing horsepower out of tractor fuel. He'd learned that every mixture had a hidden reserve, a sweet spot between efficiency and explosion. If you could delay detonation by just milliseconds, you could double output without touching the pistons. That was his obsession. Detonation delay. While officers saw danger, he saw opportunity. Fuel wasn't a rule, it was a variable. Engines don't care about paperwork, he liked to say. They care about pressure and time. The official doctrine said that high octane prevented knocking by resisting ignition under compression. But Kellerman saw it differently. The secret wasn't in resistance. It was in control. To him, perfect combustion meant timing each micro-detonation so precisely that the piston rode the edge of destruction without crossing it. In theory, the chemistry was fixed. In practice, it was open ground. Kellerman began experimenting at night, long after the hangar lights went out. He drained fuel drums, siphoned benzene from old stockpiles, scavenged ethanol meant for cleaning, and stole small vials of ethyl fluid from engine maintenance kits. The mixture that resulted was unstable, deadly to breathe, and absolutely illegal to use. He didn't care. He called it Mix 151.5. The science behind it was as simple as it was blasphemous. The added aromatics raised vapor pressure and stabilized flame front propagation. In plain terms, the explosion burned slower and hotter, giving the engine more time to convert heat into power. The P-38's twin turbochargers loved it. The fuel didn't detonate early. It flowed, carrying oxygen through each compression stroke like a liquid whip. But no one else saw that beauty. Commanders saw a risk of spontaneous combustion on takeoff. Chemists warned that the fuel would eat through seals and fuel lines. Regulations prohibited its use outside controlled laboratory testing. And yet Kellerman kept mixing, in secret under canvas, surrounded by the hiss of leaking vapor and the glint of moonlight on fuel drums. To him, the manuals weren't gospel. They were compromises, written for safety, not victory. The myth of high octane had become its own kind of chain, locking innovation behind fear. Kellerman wasn't trying to defy authority. He was trying to survive it. Every pilot he watched limp back with a shot-up engine or die in a dive meant another reason to risk it. The Me-262 was rewriting the rules of air combat, and the Lightning needed a miracle just to stay relevant. If the Air Force couldn't deliver one, Kellerman would. Because the truth was simple. Limits aren't laws. They're just numbers that haven't been broken yet. And he was about to break them all. Frank Torch Kellerman was the kind of man the Air Force loved to use but hated to understand. Born in Indiana in 1914, he grew up fixing tractors and motorcycle engines in barns that smelled of gasoline and hot dust. He dropped out of high school to race dirt track cars, building his own engines from junkyard parts and running them until they exploded. Every wreck taught him something. Every bent piston was an experiment. He didn't believe in failure, just incomplete combustion. When war came, he enlisted as a mechanic, not because of patriotism, but because he wanted access to better engines. "They've got the best toys," he'd say. Assigned to the 479th Fighter Group in England, he found himself surrounded by precision tools, polished procedures, and men who worshipped the manual more than the machine. That didn't sit well with him. To Kellerman, a good engine wasn't a set of tolerances. It was a living thing. It talked through vibrations, through temperature, through the color of the exhaust. If it smoked gray, it was tired. If it smoked blue, it was lying. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison V1710 engines and turbochargers, was the most complex machine he'd ever seen, and the most temperamental. The P-38 could fly high and fast, escorting bombers deep into Germany, but its twin engines demanded constant babysitting. Each cylinder was an orchestra of pressure, timing, and airflow. If one note fell out of tune, the entire performance died. Pilots loved the speed, but cursed the maintenance. By 1944, Kellerman's airfield had turned into a graveyard of engine failures. Turbo seals blew under pressure, fuel lines froze in cold air, and detonations cracked pistons like glass. Pilots came home alive, only to have their engines condemned as non-repairable. Kellerman refused to accept it. "Metal don't quit," he said. "People do." His obsession deepened when the Me-262 jet appeared. Suddenly, the old rules didn't matter. German jets climbed faster, dived harder, and dictated every engagement. Allied pilots couldn't chase them. They could only ambush them. The Air Force's official answer was to avoid combat above 25,000 feet. Kellerman's answer was simpler: make the Lightning faster. He began studying everything he could about fuel, not just its octane rating, but its behavior. He wrote notes on vaporization rates, detonation delay, and cooling efficiency on scrap cardboard. He scavenged chemistry manuals from a local British university and spent nights talking with fuel depot officers about additives. Most thought he was crazy. "Torch," they'd say, "you're going to blow up half the base." Maybe he was, but he was also right. His early experiments were primitive, adding small amounts of benzene to standard avgas and recording engine temperature changes. The results were immediate. The engines ran smoother. Cylinder head temperatures dropped by 20 degrees. At first, no one noticed. Then one pilot, Lieutenant Don McCready, took off with one of Kellerman's modified tanks and returned grinning. "Whatever you did," he said, "don't stop." Word spread through the maintenance crews. They called it torch fuel. Some swore it smelled different, sharper, almost sweet. Others said it burned cleaner, leaving fewer deposits. Kellerman just called it balanced. But for every supporter, there was a skeptic. The base chemist warned that the mix could destroy seals, corrode carburetors, and cause vapor lock. The commander warned that unauthorized chemical modification violated at least 3 standing regulations. Kellerman's reply was simple: so does losing. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was tired of funerals. Every engine that failed at altitude was another coffin coming home. He'd watched pilots fall out of the sky because their fuel burned too fast or too dirty. He'd listened to the silence after a radio call cut short by static. So when he looked at the Me-262, he didn't see a miracle of technology. He saw a problem to solve. If the Germans had jet thrust, the Americans still had something better: endurance, turbochargers, and ingenuity. To Kellerman, that was enough. All he needed was a way to keep the mixture burning longer, hotter, and cleaner. just enough to bridge the gap between piston and jet. The textbook said it couldn't be done. The manual said it was impossible. But manuals were written in offices. Kellerman worked in mud, and the mud was where miracles happened. In every hangar across England, numbers ruled the war, temperatures, pressures, and limits etched into metal plates on every engine. For the Allison V-1710 that powered the P-38 Lightning, those numbers were sacred. 60 inches of manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM, 150 grade fuel, and a detonation margin thinner than a pilot's nerve. The numbers weren't meant to be broken. They were meant to protect. But protection doesn't win wars. Power does. By 1944, the science of combustion had become the invisible front line. Engineers worked as hard as pilots, calculating energy densities, vaporization coefficients, and detonation indexes. The U.S. Army Air Forces ran on octane as much as courage. 100-130 grade avgas, the standard Allied blend, was a triumph of industrial chemistry. It could sustain 100% load for hours without detonating. Then came the superfuel, 150 grade, pushed into service after 1943. It was the chemical equivalent of a miracle. The RAF called it purple passion. It let Spitfires and P-51s climb faster, run richer, and fight higher. But it came at a cost. It required constant refining, careful storage, and precise tuning. Even with the best mix, turbocharged engines still suffered from pre-ignition at altitude. Once a piston detonated early, the rest followed like dominoes. Broken rings, warped rods, total failure. The statistics told the story. Over 40% of P-38 engine losses in 1944 came from fuel-related issues, not combat. At full throttle, the Lightning's twin Allisons consumed 400 gallons per hour, turning a single sortie into a logistical nightmare. Each cylinder endured pressures of 1,000 psi, enough to tear the metal apart if combustion timing was even a fraction off. That was the knife edge Kellerman lived on. He knew that octane wasn't just a number, it was time. Each increase delayed detonation by microseconds. Each microsecond gave the piston more room to move before the explosion hit, converting energy into thrust instead of destruction. It was the math of endurance. And that math was killing the Lightning. The Luftwaffe's Me-262 didn't care about detonation. Its jet turbines burned kerosene. Low octane, high heat, no compression cycle to fail. They didn't stall, didn't knock, didn't melt pistons. They just roared past. Every mission report told the same story. Jets appeared, strafed, vanished. On paper, the P-38 couldn't compete. Its theoretical top speed was 414 miles per hour. Its service ceiling 44,000 feet. Its detonation margin unforgiving. No pilot dared run full throttle for more than a minute. That meant the Me-262, with its 540 mph bursts, ruled the sky. Unless the numbers changed. Kellerman believed that combustion science could be bent, even if it meant breaking regulations. His new mixture, 1 part benzene for cooling, 1 part ethanol for burn extension stabilized with lead additive, had shifted the detonation index from 150 to an estimated 162. It didn't sound like much, but in engine math, that was everything. A 5% increase in octane margin meant a 7% increase in permissible boost pressure. A 7% increase in boost meant a 20 to 25 km/h increase in speed. In air combat, that was the difference between living and dying. He recorded it all in a notebook scrawled with grease stains and fingerprints. Vapor pressure stable at -20 Celsius. Bond. Knock resistance exceptional. Cylinder heads cooler. Smell stronger. He wasn't guessing. He was measuring. His fuel didn't detonate early. It burned steady. It didn't boil under altitude. It held firm. It didn't corrode the tanks. It cleaned them. For the first time in months, Kellerman's engines sounded right. To the officers, the idea of exceeding 60 inches of manifold pressure was suicide. But when Kellerman's test pilot throttled past 65, and the engine held, that number died. The P-38 hit 475 miles in level flight that day. The fuel tanks came back empty, but the pistons came back whole. It was chemistry as rebellion. He'd proven that safety limits were not divine laws, just bureaucratic guesses wrapped in fear. When he sent his results to command, the reply was predictable. Unauthorized experimentation will result in court-martial. But in the war's final spring, no one cared about paperwork anymore. The sky was filling with jets, and the only thing that mattered was who got there first. And thanks to one mechanic with a barrel of chemicals and the nerve to mix them wrong, the lightning just might. The night was black, wet, and reeking of gasoline. Canvas tarps flapped in the wind over rows of fuel drums stacked beside a half-collapsed hangar. Frank Torch Kellerman crouched behind them, sleeves rolled up, face lit by the flicker of a Zippo. Every breath carried the sting of vapor and lead. He wasn't supposed to be there. The base commander had already ordered all unauthorized fuel experiments to stop. The problem was, Kellerman didn't believe in authorized when engines were dying in the sky. In front of him sat two drums marked Avgas 150, one dented fuel pump, and a collection of glass bottles stolen from the field medic's kit. Each labeled in grease pencil, benzene, alcohol, ethyl, stabilizer. He'd spent weeks refining his ratios, testing volatility in tiny batches, until he found one that didn't blow his eyebrows off. Now it was time for a full-scale mix. He poured each chemical like a bartender making a deadly cocktail, stirring with a bent wrench, listening to the faint hiss as vapors met oxygen. The liquid shimmered, an iridescent blue-green sheen under the lantern light. When the mix was done, he filled a single 55-gallon drum, sealed it, and scrawled one word across the side, 151 1/2. At dawn, the first test began. Lieutenant Don McCready, a pilot too reckless for his own good, volunteered. His P-38 had been grounded twice for detonation issues. He figured it couldn't get worse. "If she blows," he told Kellerman, "make sure my cigarettes don't go to waste." Kellerman watched as the twin Allisons roared to life. The exhaust shimmered like a mirage. The engine note changed, lower, smoother, almost predatory. "Throttle to 60, he shouted. McCready pushed forward. No knock, no sputter. Kellerman motioned higher, 65. Still clean. The sound was unreal, like silk tearing at supersonic speed. The plane rolled, took off, and climbed. At 10,000 feet, McCready radioed back. "Running smoother than church bells. Manifold holding 70. No shake." Kellerman stared at the dials on his portable gauge. Every number in the red, and yet steady. When McCready landed 20 minutes later, he didn't speak. He just stepped down, helmet off, eyes wide, a grin cutting through the soot. "You're out of your damn mind, Torch. Don't ever stop." The next tests came fast. A second pilot, then a third. Each flight stretched the limits further. The engines ran hotter but cleaner, the turbochargers maintaining thrust long after the manual said they should stall. One even broke 475 mph in a shallow dive, a number Kellerman barely dared to write down. Then the message came from Group Command. "Cease all chemical tampering immediately. Investigation pending." Kellerman ignored it. That same night, he hid his remaining fuel drums behind the hangar, draining the official stockpile and replacing it with his mix. He figured it was easier to ask forgiveness after the mission than permission before it. The next morning, 10 Lightnings fueled up for a bomber escort run toward Leipzig. Every one of them unknowingly carried the forbidden blend. At 20,000 feet, when the Luftwaffe fighters appeared, the pilots felt it immediately. The throttles responded sharper. The engines climbed faster. No knock, no strain. When they hit full boost, the P-38s didn't just keep up. They chased. German pilots who had once circled them like hawks suddenly found themselves hunted. The Lightnings darted through the sky like silver knives. One squadron report recorded the impossible. Engines achieved sustained 68 inches manifold pressure. Enemy disengaged due to speed disadvantage. Back on the ground, Kellerman stood at the edge of the runway as the first lightning landed, wingtips glistening with frost. The pilots climbed out laughing, shouting, "We outran jets!" No one believed them at first. The engineers said it was impossible. The flight officers accused them of misreading their gauges. But the cameras didn't lie. The gun footage showed lightnings closing on Me-262s, shots hitting fuselages that should have been untouchable. The next day, investigators arrived. They found Kellerman's fuel drums, the tools, the logs. They sealed the site and called it a containment breach. He was summoned to HQ for questioning. The charges: endangerment, misuse of restricted chemicals, tampering with regulated aviation materials. But before the ink dried, a report from Intelligence Command arrived, confirming 2 Me-262s destroyed in that same mission. Both kills credited to P-38 pilots using non-standard fuel mixtures. Kellerman's commanding officer signed the paper, handed it to him, and said quietly, "They can't court-martial results." For once, Kellerman didn't argue. He just smiled, eyes reflecting the sunlight off a row of gleaming P-38s. Because for the first time since the jets arrived, the Lightnings had fought back. And won. And all it took was a little chemistry the rule book couldn't approve. By the end of March 1945, the numbers began to spread faster than the orders to suppress them. Every maintenance crew in the 479th Fighter Group whispered about torch fuel. It wasn't listed on any requisition forms, didn't exist in any lab manual, but everyone knew it worked. The pilots swore by it, the mechanics swore to secrecy, and the results spoke for themselves. Within 2 weeks of the first mission, sortie reports showed the impossible. Climb rates up 18%, fuel efficiency unchanged, detonation incidents 0, and most telling of all, engine replacements dropped by half. The Lightnings weren't just running harder, they were running better. The math didn't lie. Every gallon of Kellerman's blend delivered more chemical energy per stroke, more cooling efficiency per burn, and less residue per hour of flight. The modifications had pushed the Allison V1710 engine beyond its documented limits. In simple terms, it was doing what every pilot had been begging for since 1943, keeping its power all the way up the climb. The difference was brutal on the enemy. The Luftwaffe had already been stretched thin, bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. The Me-262, their pride, was supposed to be the war's savior, a technological miracle that outran every Allied piston fighter. But torch fuel erased that margin. For the first time, German jet pilots found themselves pursued instead of chasing. Recon footage from bomber formations began showing something new: the contrails of P-38s and P-51s closing distance on 262s. One film even captured the moment a Lightning slipped into firing range before the jet broke away in panic. Analysts thought it was a fluke, wind advantage maybe. Then it happened again, and again. Statistically, it made no sense. The Me-262's 540 mph burst speed should have outclassed the Lightning's 475 mph ceiling. But the chemistry had changed the arithmetic. At high altitude, where thin air robbed turbochargers of oxygen, the new blend maintained stable burn and pressure. The result? Sustained thrust curves that no jet engine could anticipate. For the pilots, it felt like divine intervention. One letter home from Captain McCready read, "The engines don't cough anymore. They sing. When the throttle hits full, it feels like the air just gets out of your way." Another pilot joked, "I think Torch built a deal with the devil." But in truth, it was math. Quiet, dirty, and perfect. Kellerman's log showed a consistent improvement in pressure stability. Average manifold pressure climbed from 60 to 68 inches, with no mechanical failure recorded over 40 sorties. Cylinder head temperature dropped by 15 degrees. Exhaust flame color evened out. He wrote one line at the bottom of his report: "Engines breathe again." Yet success brought attention. By April, inspectors from the 8th Air Force's Chemical Division arrived. They confiscated samples, took photos, and interviewed Kellerman under threat of disciplinary action. He tried to explain. He showed them data, flight results, thermodynamic calculations scrawled on ration paper. They listened, nodded, then ordered every remaining barrel of unverified compound destroyed. That night, the airfield burned bright orange. Dozens of drums went up in flames as soldiers dumped torch fuel into ditches and set it alight. Kellerman stood at the edge of the fire, silent. To him, it wasn't destruction. It was confirmation. The mix burned steady, hot, and pure. No sputtering, no flare-ups. Just clean, perfect combustion. He turned to a friend and said quietly, "That's what winning sounds like. But bureaucracy doesn't surrender easily." Within a week, the official investigation classified his work as non-replicable experimental testing. Command pretended it never happened. The pilots didn't. They began mixing their own versions in secret, using whatever additives they could find. It wasn't as perfect as Kellerman's original formula, but it worked. The edge held. The jets began losing their dominance. Allied bomber groups reported record-low losses. And by May 1945, when the Me-262's final sorties ended in retreat, the skies of Europe belonged to the piston engine again. The chemistry of defiance had turned into a weapon. The formula remained buried in paperwork, but its results rippled through every maintenance tent and flight report. The myth of the jet's invincibility was over, not because of better planes, but because one mechanic refused to accept the limits written in ink. In war, collapse doesn't always come from the enemy. Sometimes it begins with a number scratched in grease pencil on a fuel drum. April 9, 1945. Weather: broken clouds at 15,000 feet, visibility moderate, wind out of the west. Mission 412B, bomber escort, 30 B-17s bound for Dessau. The enemy, still desperate, still dangerous. Every man in the 479th Fighter Group knew the drill. Protect the bombers. Stay alive. Stay under 25,000 feet if the jets appeared. But this morning, the order changed. The Lightning flight would fly high cover. The experiment had already begun. 4 P-38 Lightnings took off from Wattisham under full load, twin propellers biting through the morning haze. In the lead cockpit sat Lieutenant Don McCready, Kellerman's favorite test pilot, the man who never lifted off without a cigarette in his teeth and a joke about dying. His plane, Lucky Mary, was running a 70-gallon mix of Kellerman's forbidden formula. No one else on base knew. As they climbed, the air thinned, the engine screamed, and McCready felt it again. That unholy smoothness. No sputter, no stutter, no sudden drop in manifold pressure. Just the clean, relentless surge of power. The gauges hovered near the red, but steady. He eased the throttle forward, watched the altimeter rise past 27,000 feet, and grinned. She still got more. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, fast movers. 2 silver specks slicing through the upper cloud deck. Me-262s. The sound came seconds later. The deep, hollow shriek of jet turbines. The bombers tightened formation, gunners swiveling in panic. Everyone knew how this went. The jets would dive, tear through the formation, and vanish. But this time they didn't dive fast enough. McCready pushed throttle to the stop. Both turbochargers whined like saw blades. The P-38's airspeed needle swung past 450. Then 470. The plane trembled but held. He called out, "They're not pulling away! Repeat, the bastards aren't pulling away!" The first Me-262 made its attack run, cannons blazing, rounds cutting through the air like falling anvils. A B-17's tail shredded, flames spilling out. McCready rolled hard, slipped behind the jet, and saw the impossible. The Lightning's nose closing distance. "Jesus, it's working," he muttered. He lined up his shot. The 20mm cannon thudded once. Twice. The tracers stitched across the jet's tail. The Me-262 burst into flame, broke apart mid-roll. Over the radio, someone shouted, "You got one! You hit a jet!" But there was no time to celebrate. The second Me-262 dove from above, engines howling, closing fast. McCready yanked his yoke, throttled again, and climbed into it. The Lightning shouldn't have been able to match the jet's vertical acceleration. But Kellerman's mix held steady. Boost pressure, 68 inches. Cylinder temps, green. He pulled up through his own contrail, nose pointed straight at the oncoming blur of aluminum. The German pilot flinched, expecting the lightning to stall. It didn't. The two aircraft crossed paths 50 feet apart, each pilot glimpsing the other's face for a heartbeat. The jet overshot, unable to turn. McCready banked, dropped behind, and watched as the Me-262 dove too low, its starboard engine flaming out. Seconds later, it hit the ground. Silence filled the radio channel. The bomber crews couldn't believe what they'd seen. In one mission, the impossible had happened. Piston against jet, and the piston had won. When McCready landed, the entire airfield gathered around Lucky Mary. The mechanic stared at the gauges. Engine pressure had peaked beyond 70 inches. Any normal mixture would have detonated. But not this one. The engines idled smooth, clean, perfect. An intelligence officer asked him, "What did you do up there?" McCready shrugged. "Nothing special. Just flew her the way she wanted to be flown." Behind the hangar, Kellerman listened quietly, pretending to tinker with a wrench. He didn't need the praise. The roar of those engines was enough. That night, the mission report landed on the commander's desk. 2 Me-262s destroyed. No P-38 losses. Sustained 68-inch manifold pressure recorded. Recommendation: investigate non-standard performance fuel used by 479th Maintenance Section. Kellerman folded the copy into his pocket. The report called it non-standard. He called it freedom. For one day in April, the Lightning had been faster than the jet. Not by luck, not by magic, but by the courage of one mechanic who believed that rules were just the first draft of progress. And that belief had just rewritten the laws of flight. 2 days after the Dessau mission, Frank "Torch" Kellerman found himself standing in front of a long oak table in a temporary field headquarters outside Wattisham. Behind it sat 3 officers in freshly pressed uniforms, faces tight, hands folded over paperwork that looked too clean for war. The man in the middle wore rimless glasses and had the tone of someone who thought precision was patriotism. His name was Major Harold Whitmore, Chemical Logistics Division. To Kellerman, he just looked like another man who'd never smelled engine oil in his life. Whitmore began reading. "Sergeant Kellerman, you are charged with willful disobedience of Air Force Material Command Regulations 7131 and 8223. Unauthorized use of restricted additives and endangering flight personnel through chemical modification of government property." He looked up. "Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Kellerman nodded. "Yes, sir, but I understand gravity just fine. It's the thing that kills pilots when their engines stop." The room went silent. The major didn't appreciate the joke. "Your concoction, this so-called 151.5 fuel, was mixed without oversight, without testing, and without authorization. Do you have any idea what could have happened if those planes exploded mid-air?" Kellerman crossed his arms. "They didn't. That's not the point. It's the only point that matters." From the back of the room, a new voice spoke. Colonel Robert Mills, commanding officer of the 479th, stepped forward. His uniform wasn't as clean. His face looked like it had been baked in exhaust and wind. "Major," he said evenly, "if you're looking for explosions, you should have seen the Me-262s, 2 of them, turned to dust by my men, running on that illegal fuel." Whitmore stiffened. "Colonel, this is not about—" Mills cut him off. "This is exactly about results. You bureaucrats keep telling us to fight jets with patience. My men fight them with horsepower." The major cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, our protocols exist for safety. Chemistry isn't guesswork." Kellerman leaned forward. "Neither is survival." A pause. Even Whitmore couldn't ignore the data sitting on his own desk. Mission 412B. 2 Me-262 kills. 0 mechanical failures. Not a single piston damaged. Not a single pilot lost. He shuffled the papers, sighed, and said finally, "The laboratory results were consistent. The sample you submitted demonstrated higher detonation thresholds, improved pressure stability, and reduced carbon scoring." He looked up sharply. "How did you calculate the ratio?" Kellerman smiled faintly. "By smell, mostly." The major blinked, not sure whether to be impressed or horrified. "You could have killed them all." Kellerman's tone was calm, not defiant. "They were already dying. I just gave them a chance to die later." The colonel hid a smirk. The major removed his glasses, rubbed his temple, and muttered something about field-level insanity. When the hearing ended, the paperwork was quietly marked Classified Fuel Optimization Trial. Kellerman's suspension order was shredded before it ever reached the chain of command. The brass didn't promote him. They didn't commend him. But 2 weeks later, a new technical bulletin circulated across the 8th Air Force. Revised War Emergency Fuel Procedures, Aromatic Additive Guidelines. Every squadron received the memo. Every mechanic knew what it really meant. The document never mentioned his name, but it detailed his exact ratios, his exact methods, wrapped in bureaucratic language that hid the truth. The forbidden blend had become policy. Back at the hangar, Kellerman stood under a P-38 wing as a pilot passed him the mimeographed bulletin. "Looks familiar," the pilot said with a grin. Kellerman just wiped his hands on a rag. "Guess they like my handwriting." From that day forward, the lightnings ran hotter, cleaner, faster, officially sanctioned by the same system that had threatened to court-martial the man who made it possible. He never bragged, never demanded credit. He didn't care about medals. To him, the victory wasn't in recognition. It was in the roar of a perfect engine under full throttle, the sound that told him every drop of his dangerous chemistry was worth it. Because in war, rules can keep you alive, but breaking them can win the sky. And Frank Torch Kellerman had just taught the United States Army Air Forces how to do both. By summer 1945, the Luftwaffe's final act was collapsing under its own weight. Fuel was scarce, pilots inexperienced, and the once feared Me-262 had become a target rather than a terror. Allied fighter groups, running on Kellerman's refined aromatic blend, were pushing deeper into German airspace with impunity. What had once been a technological chasm between piston and jet had narrowed until it vanished entirely. The P-38s weren't supposed to keep up, but they did. Mission logs tell the story better than any rumor. Between March and May, Lightning squadrons reported a 40% drop in engine-related mission aborts and a 25% improvement in climb-to-combat altitude times. The Me-262, the marvel of German engineering, had become just another aircraft to dodge Allied bullets. Historians later called it the quiet equalizer, not a new aircraft, not a new weapon, but a change in what went into the tank. For Kellerman, there was no recognition. His contribution was buried under layers of classification and red tape. When the war ended, the Air Force issued a formal commendation to the Maintenance and Chemical Services of the 8th Air Force for outstanding field innovation. His name was never printed. His notes were seized and archived under fuel optimization, experimental data. But among pilots, the truth traveled faster than paperwork. They knew who had changed their engines from fragile machines into predators. Every Lightning crew that touched down on trembling legs after a mission knew whose hands had made it possible. The men started calling it Torch Mix. The name stuck. After the war, declassified documents confirmed what he'd done. The illegal compound's combustion profile extended detonation resistance by 12%, translating to an increase of 68-70 inches of safe manifold pressure, nearly matching the jet's thrust-to-drag advantage. It was, statistically, the most effective unsanctioned modification in U.S. aviation history. Engineers later admitted that the Army's safety margins had been too conservative. The Allison Phi 1710 had always been capable of more. It just needed a man willing to ignore the paperwork to prove it. When asked decades later how such a small change could shift an entire air war, One surviving pilot said, "You don't need miracles to win, just men who stop asking permission." Kellerman never spoke to reporters. He refused interviews, declined medals, and never tried to patent his mixture. He went home to Indiana, rebuilt an old workshop behind his father's barn, and spent the rest of his life tuning race engines for kids who couldn't afford new cars. When one of them asked him about the war, he just said, "I made a plane go faster than it should have. That's all." But it wasn't all. He had taken a machine that was supposed to be obsolete and made it sing louder than the future itself. In the cold, brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, Kellerman had done something the textbook said was impossible. He'd outthought the jet age with nothing but instinct, a wrench, and a stolen drum of fuel. His work didn't end the war, but it ended the myth of untouchable technology. The Me-262 had represented perfection. Kellerman proved that perfection can be outrun by persistence. The official records never mention him, but the math does. Every after-action report, every speed curve, every drop in failure rates, all trace back to one nameless note in a classified file marked Field Chemistry, 1945. Frank Torch Kellerman, the man who was nearly court-martialed for tampering with jet fuel, became, without ever knowing it, the reason the Allied piston engine remained relevant to the very end. The chemist who beat the jets, not by inventing a miracle, by daring to pour one. When the war ended, Europe went silent. The thunder of engines faded, the contrails dissolved, and the skies that had once glowed with fire became blue again. Most men went home to medals or memories. Frank Torch Kellerman went home to a small workshop on the outskirts of Evansville, Indiana, the same place where he'd first learned to mix gasoline and oil by smell instead of math. He never talked about the missions, never mentioned the hearings, never said the word fuel without a grin. The war, to him, was just another job, a noisy, dangerous experiment that happened to save lives. What he cared about was simpler, that his engines had worked when it mattered, that the pilots who trusted him came back. Neighbors said they could always tell when Kellerman was working. The scent of benzene and lead would drift down the road, sharp and sweet. The windows of his shop glowed orange at night, the same way the airfield had glowed when he burned the forbidden mix for the last time. One summer evening in 1952, a local journalist came by asking about his war invention. Kellerman just laughed. There wasn't any invention, just a mistake that worked better than it should have. He reached into a wooden box under his bench and pulled out a dented brass fuel cap from a P-38 Lightning. The edges were blackened, the threads half melted from heat. He turned it over in his hand and said quietly, "Everything I ever needed to know about war is written on this cap. You build something, someone tries to tell you it's wrong, and if you're lucky, it flies before it explodes." The reporter never published that quote, but it stayed in his notes. Years later, aviation historians would call Kellerman's mistake a turning point in the science of high-octane performance. It paved the way for Cold War jet fuels, rocket propellants, and the concept of power margins still used in aviation engineering today. But Kellerman didn't live to see that. He died in 1968. His hands still stained with oil, his old shop filled with empty cans of racing fuel and broken pistons that looked more like trophies than trash. On the wall above his workbench hung one photograph, a P-38 Lightning in flight, sunlight flashing off its wings, climbing through the clouds like it was defying gravity itself. Scrawled on the back of that photo were 5 words: "Burn clean, fly higher, always." That was the philosophy that defined him, not rebellion for its own sake, but the refusal to settle for good enough. In a war ruled by blueprints and orders, Kellerman's genius came from dirt and instinct. His story isn't about chemistry, it's about courage. The kind that burns quietly, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that believes even the smallest act of defiance can change the course of history. Because the truth of victory isn't written in medals or headlines. It's written in the smell of a running engine, hot, perfect, alive, and the memory of one man who looked at a rule book and decided to light it on fire. And somewhere in the faint roar of every aircraft that still takes off today, there's a little bit of that sound. The echo of Torch Kellerman's miracle mix, still burning cleaner than anyone said it could. The smell of victory wasn't smoke or oil. It was progress, and the courage to ignite it.